This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here and speak with you today. Basically, I want to talk about two things. I want to talk about the dynamics between the United States and China in the recent period, particularly since the advent of the Obama administration. And then I want to talk about China's rise, because I think China's rise is very important, as Americans at least think about the situation in U.S.-China relations. And so let's take a look first, if we may, about the Obama administration policy toward China. How's it going? And I think what you can see is that Mr. Obama, when he entered office, entered with an idea to cooperate with China, to work with China closely in areas of great international concern, like the global economic crisis and climate change and terrorism and non-proliferation and things of that matter. And of course, we had a dynamic between the governments of the United States and China that prevailed since the Bush administration. Really began around 2003, where the two governments really emphasized the positive. When they got together, the leaders of the governments would generally be very positive, and they didn't talk about their differences very much. But there were differences, and these showed up in other ways in the U.S. society through the media and other places. But in China, the discourse tended to be more controlled, and it was quite positive in U.S.-China relations. And so specialists look at this, and they discern, and this is just a sketch here, but the reasons for this positive relationship between the two governments are not hard to understand. The first, and I think they will continue, they're based on pragmatism, they're based on circumstances, but number one, the two governments benefit from having positive interaction with one another. We call it engagement. They benefit from this. Number two, the two countries have become so interdependent that if one side emphasizes the negatives in the relationship, it hurts the other side, but it hurts themselves as well. And so they tend not to do this. And the third element to keep in mind is that Mr. Hu Jintao, the leader of China, is very much like Mr. Obama. He's got such a range of issues that he has to deal with that the last thing he wants is a problem with the United States. And Mr. Obama, I think, has the same thinking about China. He doesn't want to have a big difficulty with the United States, with China, if he can avoid it. So these three reasons, I think, explain why the leaders of the two countries emphasize the positive in their relationship, and we have an equilibrium that does do this sort of thing. Now, over the last 2 years, we've seen some changes. These changes are not all that significant, it seems to me, but they are changes in the way the Chinese have gone about dealing with the relationship. They've been more public about some of the differences between the United States and China. And these have shown up. Our surveillance ships in the South China Sea have been harassed by the Chinese. Some Chinese officials have said they want to move away from investment in U.S. securities. They want to move away from the U.S. dollar. The Chinese made a big deal about an arms sales transfer between the United States and Taiwan at the end of last year. And they made a big deal about Mr. Obama's meeting with the Dalai Lama early in 2010. And then earlier this year, they said that the United States didn't have the right to exercise in the Yellow Sea with South Korea in response to North Korea's sinking of a South Korean ship. They said this is a threat to China. And they said that the United States didn't have the right to carry out naval activities in the South China Sea. Now, the Obama government really didn't give in to China in any of these things, as far as I can see. And recently, they've sort of leaned back a little bit and taken some steps in Southeast Asia in particular, which show that China will bear some cost if they persist in these sort of postures. But the point that I want to raise here is that what this shows is that there are significant differences between the United States and China. And this is something that probably most people here recognize. But if you look just at the government discourse in the past several years, you would have think, well, there really aren't serious differences, but there are. And if you look at the historical record, you see that China has always been concerned about a big power around its periphery that could take advantage of China. They were taken advantage of as a country for 200 years. And they very much are very attentive to this sort of thing. So a country like the United States, even if it's a nice country, is going to be a problem from the Chinese point of view. And then the Americans. And our side, historically, has been very value-laden. We like countries that move in directions that we like. And if they don't move, if they're really big and don't move in directions we like, we tend not to like them. And China is like that. And we've gone through periods when we really didn't like China very much because they really were determined not to move in directions that we felt were appropriate. And I think the People's Republic of China today is one of those phases. Now, and of course, we had a terrible history with China during the Cold War. Awful things happened between one another. The Korean War was a terrible war. But that's over. Nixon and Mao got together. You all remember that. Big breakthrough. Everything's fine after that. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Because when Nixon and Kissinger went to Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, they said, we're going to get out of the way on Taiwan. Well, we never did. And Nixon and Kissinger didn't tell anybody. I worked in the US government for 31 years in various capacities. I never knew this until it came out in disclosure of documents. I think in the late 90s it came out, that this has actually been the pledge. And so from a Chinese point of view, they look at the records, and what do they say? You Americans are not trustworthy on Taiwan. You're double-crossers. And they have a point. And then both sides, even in this period of 40 years of reconciliation, we're always worried about the other one taking advantage of us. The Americans think the Chinese are taking advantage of us recently on economics. And the Chinese don't want to join the climate change talks the way the US want them to do it because they feel the Americans will take advantage of them. This sensitivity is very strong. And then in America, we have a lot of secrecy in our China policy, just like Nixon did. This has persisted over the years. It's easier to manage the relationship when it's secret, if you're a practitioner. But it doesn't build a consensus. And so we have a positive dynamic between the two governments, and 53% of Americans disapprove of the Chinese administration. Really hard to have a consensus on that basis. And so we have a weakness in that regard. But it makes Americans, in many capacities, the media and elsewhere, suspicious of the administration because they basically don't agree with the thrust of the policy. And US non-governmental interaction with China, which is very important, tends to be value-laden. They want their values proposed. And then there's the Chinese side. Now, the Chinese issues with the United States, there are many of them, but it's hard to summarize. So let me try to summarize it this way. I was at a meeting with Chinese strategists in Beijing about 10 years ago. There were 7 of them, and there was 1 of me. And I had a record of working for Congress, and Congress is, a problem for China. They don't like Congress, though the Congressional Research Service is very nonpartisan, very balanced, and so forth. But anyway, the discussion wasn't going too well. And so one guy stood up, and he said, you Americans, you want to be the leading power in the world. You want to be the leading power in the Asian-Pacific region. You want to continue weapons sales and support for Taiwan. And you want to change our political system. Now, there were 7 of them and 1 of me, so I mumbled something. But to myself, knowing mainstream American opinion, I said, yes, 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 yes. And the fellow understood this, and he said, you're dreaming if you think we will accept that. We will wait you out. And these are the differences. Now, this guy's a hardliner, but these are the differences. The Chinese don't like the US to be the leading power in the world. They'll live with it, but they don't like it. They don't like the US being the big power in the Asia-Pacific region. They obviously don't like that. They don't like the US trying to selling weapons to Taiwan. And they don't like the US trying to change their political system. These are fundamental differences. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm trying to be more realistic about our relationship. We will stay together with China. It's very pragmatic. For those 3 reasons, we will stay together. But boy, do we have differences. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have differences. And that's where the rise of China comes into play. Because in this dynamic, this equilibrium, it's dependent on circumstances. And if the circumstances change, and I don't think they will anytime soon, but if they do change, this could lead to a difference. And so many specialists in the media, commentators, others, in the last 2 years have seen this Chinese assertiveness as the beginning of a new trend. That the Chinese are now, they see themselves a lot more powerful. They see themselves as coming out of the economic crisis much better than the United States. The US is in decline. And therefore, it's time to really, it's payback time. You see what I mean? If you're a realist, you look at it this time, where the Chinese will now put pressure on the United States in these areas of differences, because they are now ascendant and the US is in decline. And so I think it's very important then to have a sense of rising China and how significant it is. And this is something that I'd urge you to just think about. And what I think, many of these assertions seem to be a little unbalanced. And they often look at the negative parts or the weaknesses of the United States, and they look at the strong points of China, and they come to a conclusion. Now, if you do that at Georgetown, at least in my class, it's grade creep. You get a C+ or a B-, which is an awful grade, actually, these days. And so, because it's incomplete. It's just incomplete. You need to look at the strengths of the United States as well as its weaknesses. You've got to look at the weaknesses of China as well as the strengths of China, and then come to a conclusion might work. Well, I've come up with a way of looking at things that are fairly tangible so that you can judge whether you think there is a power shift going on, that China is now the ascendant power and the US is really in decline. And I look at, now there are various things you can look at. You can look at internal Chinese weaknesses. I find that very complicated, and it's hard for me to come to a bottom line on that. Where I can measure this is in Asia. China is rising. Asia is the area where China has always been the most influential. And my proposition is this: let's look at China's rise in Asia. If China's going to be a setter of objectives in the world, if it's going to be influential in other parts of the world in a way where it can throw its weight around, it's got to have a secure situation in Asia. If it's going to be the leading power in Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, and Europe, it's got to watch its back. If Asia isn't secure, it's not going to be able to do it. And what I see is that China's rise in Asia is very encumbered. It's going to be very difficult for China. It will rise in Asia. It is rising in Asia. But to dominate Asia, to be secure in Asia, this is going to take a long, long time. And I want to explain that. And therefore, to understand, and therefore, this is the basis of my judgment that I don't think there's any power shift going on between the United States and China these days, because the Chinese have so many preoccupations, and this is preoccupation number one in international affairs. So let me try to explain that, and I can do it, I think, succinctly. I used to work for Congress, and so when I did a lot of briefing in Congress, you have to do things in 11 seconds. Sometimes you have to do 11 seconds. This is the so-called 11-second rule. Are you familiar with this? No? You know what it is? You know what it is. She knows. Okay. But anyway, you have to be very succinct, and I don't have time for a long story to explain it to you, but it's basically the member is so distracted that you only get them for certain segments of time, and usually the best thing to do is be in the elevator next to them when you're going up. Now, and then the member will get the point, 11 seconds. So I have two ways of looking at China's rise in Asia. And the first one is looking at China in Asia. It's been rising in Asia for 15 years. We can measure this now. How are they doing? How are they doing? And then the other way is to look at the United States and China in Asia, and we'll look at that. But first, China in Asia. Just 3 points on this, but I think they're very important ones. Number one, China has a terrible legacy. The People's Republic of China has a terrible legacy in Asia. For 40 of the 60 years of the People's Republic of China, this goes beyond Mao Zedong, the PRC was one of the most disruptive elements for most of the governments in Asia. Now, when I give this talk in China, you see, and people say, oh, gosh, what are you talking about? What's going on here? And I said, does anybody here remember the Khmer Rouge? Every step of the way, the Chinese were with the Khmer Rouge. Every step of the way. Not because they liked what they were doing domestically. It's because it was in their interest to be supportive of the Khmer Rouge. They're capable of, Chinese are capable, so when the Khmer Rouge were driven out by the Vietnamese in 1979 and brought up to the Thai border, who's on the Thai border? Chinese advisors. There they all are. Groups of them, all along the border. They were with them every step of the way. And once the Vietnamese do this, what did the Chinese do? Now, this is not Maoist China. This is Deng Xiaoping. They invade Vietnam. Teach them a lesson. They invade the place. And then they pull back. And for 10 years, they keep tension along the border. What does that tension mean? Well, some days, there were reports of 10,000 artillery shells going into Vietnam from China in a day. I asked my military friends, I said, can you do 10,000 shells a day? How do you do that? They said, if you have enough cannon, you can do it. And I guess they had enough cannon. That's pressure. And there's a whole range of these things that China did for 40 years. So China has to live this down. And they are. They're working on it. They're trying to say, peaceful rise, we're going to be good, don't worry. But whenever they fail in some regard, everybody in Asia remembers the old China. And they're very concerned about this. So they have to live this down. Second point is, as China has moved in the last 20 years to reassure its neighbors, it's made mistakes. And so in 1995, they were a little bit too pushy in the South China Sea, and of course they looked very aggressive in the Taiwan Straits crisis of 95, 96. And so they shifted their policy. They said, we got to have a reassurance policy to the governments of Asia, and they did. And it works, it's good. They are reassuring these governments, and it's considerable progress is being made. But at the same time, they still were very hostile to the United States publicly, very critical of U.S. alliance structures in the region and so forth. And so they found that they were basically getting these countries to choose. You have to choose between whether you align with us or whether you align with the United States. And it didn't work. These governments don't want to choose. It failed. And they got a president in George W. Bush who, if you pushed him, he would push back. And by 2001, they decided to put aside this issue of criticism of the United States. They downgraded that importance for them, and they focused on what? In 2002, they start going to the Americans, and they announced this in New York City, that China's rise is peaceful. And we want to reassure not only our neighbors in the region, America, we want to reassure you. That's why we're doing this. And officials in China told me, they told all sorts of people this. This is what their rationale is. Because if we don't, you're going to complicate life for us as we rise, and we don't want that complication. And so they've been reassuring the Americans ever since, with some little changes in the last year or two. So they've made mistakes. They had to shift, and they might make, and this year I think they've made some mistakes, and they're going to have to shift from that. But the best way to examine this is pretty simple. How are they doing? Let's take a look. Look at the map, okay? Are they relations with China? Who are the other three big powers in Asia? Japan, Russia, and India, right? So let's take a look. Today, China's relations with Japan. Well, they were really pretty bad in the early part of this decade. But then they got a little better. But today, they're really bad, again. Very bad relations between these two. Deep distrust. India. China's relations with India today are worse, considerably worse than they were in 2003 and 2004. Differences are very transparent. Russia. Arguably, the relations with Russia are less close than they were in 2001, 2002, than they are today. And let's take a look at the middle powers. South Korea. Now, obviously, the Chinese have really hurt themselves with South Korea over the last few months. But even before that, the relationship with South Korea, close economic relations, but very skeptical on political and security issues. And so and the relationship in 2004 was very close, and now it isn't. And then Australia. It's not on the map there, it's a little tip of it, but it's an important player. In 2004, they were very close. Now, very mixed relations. Very close economic ties, but very mixed in other ways. Southeast Asian countries, China has made steady gains there, improving relations in various ways. But what's emerging in Southeast Asia is that Indonesia, the power center traditionally of Southeast Asia, has reemerged as the leader of Southeast Asia, and it is the country in Southeast Asia that's least likely to bandwagon with China. And so the upshot of this is that China faces an environment full of these independent-minded governments, and it's very complicated, and they're not making uniform improvements in this relationship at all. It's a very mixed picture. Now, I think I have time to also look at the situation from the point of view of let's look at China's strengths in the region and look at China's limitations, and let's look at U.S. strengths and U.S. limitations in the region to put it in a comparative perspective, if you will. Okay, what are China's strengths? Trade. Trade is big trader, very important, and big trader with most of these countries, leading trader, second leading trader with most of these countries. Investment. Asian Pacific investment tends to go to China. China doesn't invest much in the Asia Pacific, some, but not a lot. And then diplomacy is the other big, strong thing. The Chinese are really good at diplomacy, both bilaterally and working with multilateral groups in the region. They have been very good. They're not so good the last year, but they're generally very good. They follow win-win diplomacy. You win, I win. We all win. It makes everybody happy. And then cultural influence. China has considerable cultural influence in Asia, and there are a lot of ethnic Chinese in the region, particularly Southeast Asia, and they tend to be supportive of China, so that's an asset. So and then behind it all is the People's Liberation Army. Very powerful, getting more powerful as the days go on. So all of this gives China a great deal of influence in the region. As far as the limitations of China, the legacy, awful legacy. Hard to live there. Patriotism. Now, patriotism doesn't have to be a bad thing. It's a good thing. Chinese people are very patriotic, and they're sort of nationalistic. Unfortunately, just about every other country in Asia is patriotic and nationalistic, too. And what does this mean? Well, it means if you have any sort of dispute, it becomes very sensitive and very hard to resolve, which means the governments don't like each other very much. And so the upshot of this is that the Chinese have facing opposition in various ways, and it's particularly hard on territorial issues. If you get into territorial issues, you can't resolve these things. It's a real impediment to improving your relationship with the region. The Chinese military expansion makes some governments in Asia, many of them, concerned about what China's overall intentions are in the region. The authoritarian and secret nature of the Chinese administration also makes some concern, not everyone, some concern. And then you get trade. Trade is such a big feature of China's strength in the region, it's important to examine it. Half of China's trade is controlled by foreign invested enterprises in China. Half of it. So are you dealing with China trade? You're dealing with Sony trade, Samsung trade, Motorola trade. Half of China's trade is processing trade. The commodity has lots of different components, and then it's often finished in China. This is a very interdependent type of trading position that China has in the region. In addition, where does all this trade, these manufactured goods in particular, where does this go? A lot of it is consumed in China, but much of it is exported. And who are the big export markets? The United States and the European Union are the big ones. And so you find this is a very interdependent type of place where China is in the trading networks. Investment. Investment is one way. What does this mean? Asian entrepreneurs integrate themselves with China. They really can't compete head-to-head with China. So they integrate with China, and they make money, and they're happy. And their governments tend to be happy. But the people in those places that depend on this for jobs, they're not so happy. The laborers can't go to China to work, and they don't have the investment coming into their country. And so that's a drag on the relationship. China doesn't give aid to compensate for this type of thing. And then you have their diplomacy, very effective, but it's win-win diplomacy. And this means that China goes to a country and says, what do you want? And the country says, well, we want 5 things. And the Chinese say, well, we agree with 3 of them. So let's have meetings about that. And so they agree. And they have all these communiques, and everything is very happy and very good. But what it means is, from the Chinese point of view, the Chinese look to the government. They say, we don't expect you to do anything you wouldn't ordinarily do. And the governments are quite content with that. But implicitly and explicitly, on the Chinese side, they're not going to do anything they wouldn't ordinarily do either. And this is very important. There's no risk, no cost, no commitment that they wouldn't ordinarily do. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And and then there is another negative for China, is that the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia are viewed with some suspicion, particularly in countries like Indonesia and Malaysia. Now, let's look at the United States. U.S. weaknesses have been getting a lot of publicity. We all know about the economic situation. During the Bush administration, the U.S. had a terrible image in the region. I do a lot of public speaking in the region. And it was really tough to be an American speaking to these audiences. They really didn't like the United States for whole unilateralism, war on terrorism, military approach, hardline in North Korea. There's a whole list of problems that the U.S. had in the relationship. What are the strengths of the United States in the region? The strengths of the United States don't get much attention. And I found these out by doing interviews. And for the last 6 years, I've been doing interviews with officials in 10 Asia-Pacific countries. I've had 210 up to this point. I did a bit of a round last summer. And the strengths boil down to two foundations that you can measure. One is security, and it goes like this. In Asia, governments matter. They make the decisions. Public opinion influences it to some degree, but basically they're very calculating. They make it on the basis of what they see as their national interest. What do they want? They want development. What do they need for development? They need stability. Is Asia stable? In their judgment, not really. Why? Because they don't trust each other. It's one of the hidden secrets of hidden aspects of Asia-Pacific is that the tensions you see between Japan and China publicly, they're emblematic throughout the region quietly. They all get together and pat each other on the back, but they really don't like each other and they don't trust each other. So where are they going to get stability? Well, they know I'm from the United States, and so about 30% of the time they look at me and they say, there's this strange country. It's really big, and it's far away. And this country, for some reason, is willing to spend $50 to $100 billion a year to maintain a security presence in Asia. And its young people are willing to sign up for the military and come to Asia and get killed if necessary to keep stability in Asia. Nobody else will do that. And we need it. That's fundamental. And so please watch that. This gets into isolationism. Will the United States become isolation? You can measure this. I'm sure if the U.S. is isolationist, this would change the calculations of many of these officials. Second point, most of these officials are concerned with export-oriented growth. And they recognize that all this Asian trade and trade with China, so much of it is dependent on export out of the region. And they see that the United States absorbs so many of these products. And so in the big trading year of 2008, the United States had a trade deficit with Asian countries of over $350 billion at a time of a trade deficit of $700 billion overall for the United States. And these government officials say our development depends on that too. America has to keep its markets open. Now these are enormous risks, costs, and commitments that the United States undertakes that are fundamentally important to the governments of Asia. And no one else does this. China runs a trade surplus, by the way, and China's not going to get any of its people killed on anything if they can help it, just like most governments in Asia. But the U.S. does this. It's so different. The asymmetry of the contribution of what the U.S. does versus what China does is enormous, and the Asian government leaders know it. They know Colin Powell used to put it this way, if an Asian leader has a 911 situation and they call 911, they really hope the United States will pick up the phone. Because if it doesn't, nothing's going to happen. And so this is, I think, still the case, ladies and gentlemen. Other strengths the U.S. has in Asia, which don't get nearly enough attention, which I think you should pay attention to. George Bush did a good job. I'm a Democrat. I apologize for the Republicans in the audience, but George Bush did a good job in Asia in managing power relationship. He really did. So I'm just saying this in deference to him. I think he did a good job in managing relations. And Mr. Obama inherited that. And that's a good foundation for his Asian policies. In addition, the U.S. security apparatus, the U.S. military is really extraordinary in how they can interact with Asia. And so they're all over the place, everywhere. And what do? Well, these governments like to work with them. Why? Because they're so good at what they do, even though it doesn't look good to what they, Iraq arms issues and things like that. But basically, they're excellent. And so they want to work with them, they want to exercise with them, and they say, oh, gee, we got this terrorist group. And the Americans say, well, we have intelligence on that. You want to exchange intelligence? And they do that. And they say, well, we can't find them, they're in the woods. And they say, well, we have a machine. What do you mean a machine? There it is, there they are. We find them at night and go get them. And so this kind of thing, very helpful, but there's more to it than that. And this is fundamental. And this is that these Asian governments know that power dynamics are changing. They want to keep the initiative in their own hands. They're independent-minded. And so what do? They work closely with China. It's good for them, but they're wary. And so they say, even in the bad times with Bush, they would say to the Americans, they wouldn't even look at them. They would say, stay close. Talk to us. Be here. Be close in this time of transition in Asia. And so they're quite happy to work closely with the United States in a whole range of ways that now are showing themselves a bit with Vietnam and other countries. One final strength of the United States is the non-governmental sector. Most of U.S. interaction with Asia is still non-governmental. It's enormously important. And many countries don't do that. China doesn't do that. So when they basically have government-led interaction. They have some, but the U.S. has had 2 centuries of this. And so these webs of relationships by foundations, by religious groups, by media, by business, are just enormous. And this is a very positive force. And it's reinforced by the very good change in U.S. immigration policy in 1965, a tremendous change, from the awful policies of the previous 100 years. And this has made many people from Asia come to the United States, they settle here, they become Americans, and yet they have very close relations with their home country. A very powerful force for the United States. So on balance, looking at it from the record, how the Chinese are doing in Asia, looking at it from the point of view how China is positioned in Asia relative to the United States and other powers, I would argue China is encumbered in Asia. It's going to take them a long time to rise in Asia. And if they can't be the leading power in Asia, how the devil are they going to be the leading power in the Middle East or Africa or Latin America? And so do I worry about China and Asia? Do I see a power shift taking place where the Chinese might start imposing their concerns on the United States? I'd say no, I'm not. Because I say they've got to deal with this. And this is going to, so when you think about China's rise, please think not about the United States, its rise. It was easy. Canada, Mexico, the 2 oceans. You can rise in that situation. Think about Prussia. And the encumbrances, maybe people aren't Eurocentric anymore. Prussia, it was surrounded by various forces, very complicated for China to rise. And so, in any event, thanks very much, and I appreciate your attention.
Inflation in the United States. Feed grains right now are at record highs. So how do you see this war playing out on the 2 currencies?
I think that basically this is an example of how the 2 sides are so interdependent that the government, I don't think, wants to have a currency war with China. And so the idea is they're still in the persuading mode and trying to pressure China to take actions on its own that would move in this direction. And this gets into the basic suspicions between the 2 administrations. I think the Americans think the Chinese are taking unfair advantage of the United States. And the Chinese feel that what the Americans are asking is going to take unfair advantage of them. And so it makes it very difficult. And I can't predict an outcome, except I would say that the administration will try very hard to avoid the type of currency war that you say is underway. I don't think it's underway. I don't think this is a war. There's a lot of posturing. There's a lot of skirmishing going on here. This is pretty small potatoes up to this point. And so the question is this going to lead to something quite serious? Because if it leads to something quite serious, I think the whole world economy is going to be affected by that. I think we'd see a big downturn in the stock markets and things of that nature. The question is about the corruption in China and how it affects American relations. It's only had an indirect effect on American relations up to this point, as far as I can see. And there's debate among specialists about how bad corruption is in China. It's obviously bad from the point of view of Americans, but is it getting worse? And I think they disagree on this. The specialists who look at this, they say, oh, it's pretty well, there's a level of it, and that's what's persisting. And if you say, well, how the Chinese what they have done over the last 15 years with this level of corruption, if you say that that's bad, well then, yes, that's bad. But the overall sense of what China has accomplished is pretty impressive from the point of view of many outside observers. And they say, okay, they're able to accomplish this even with this level of corruption, suggests that it's not a big problem. And it's clearly U.S. businesses have been in China in a big way throughout this 15 to 20-year period. So if it's going to get worse, then I think then you'd have more to worry about. But at this stage, I think it's part of doing business with China. You have to figure out how to, as an American company, you have to figure out how to work with it. The corruption tends to be in those areas of where people gain money for doing things. So it's the business people that are sort of the leading edge of Americans interacting with this level of corruption. And it's certainly a complication, but it's not, I don't think it's affected investment in China. I see investment in China, foreign investment keeps going up. It's not going down. Thanks very much.
My talk is actually entitled India on the Global Stage. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time actually talking to you about India itself, some mostly random snippets of interesting facts about India. So if I do miss anything that you're particularly interested in, please do bring it up in the questions, because it's there's so many elements to talk about, and I'm just going to select a few. Somewhat like Japan in the 80s and China in the 90s, India, the new millennium in some ways, at least from a media and publicity standpoint, really seems to belong to India. Everywhere you look, there's some kind of reference to India. Yesterday, while I was in my hotel just here, the Radisson on Alfaya Trail, I turned on, and even Univision, the Spanish conglomerate, had an Indian soap that they're showing, and that's and it's emblematic of some of the things that I've mentioned in there. So whether it's the Davos and the World Economic Forum, they actually had a special India theme for the last year and a half, really. Primarily because of prominent contributions from Indian firms. At the G20, at the Copenhagen, Climate Summit, India had a very, very key role to play in, both deflecting some of the reforms that were rightfully needed, and India teamed with China, in effect, to prevent some of those. But the fact is that they were, again, prominently in the news. In the World Trade Organization, it's the same way. I purposely left those acronyms in there to confuse you and also to remind me to tell you about them. But it's NPT stands for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. As you know, India's done a neat circumvention of that with American help, and that's a very gross overstatement. But in effect, America's proposed nuclear deal with India circumvents the NPT, which America has been long trying to get India to sign. So it's a recognition of a new reality that some of these emerging nuclear powers are frankly not going to abide by the older strictures. The Non-Aligned Movement, NAM as it was called, this came to being during the Cold War. India and Egypt, Yugoslavia, Indonesia in the 50s got together during the Cold War and saw that there was a great opportunity to be non-aligned and to, in effect, play off either side and get, hopefully, aid from both the Americans and the Soviet Union. India continues to play a very strong role in the non-aligned movement, even though the dynamics have changed, and that has benefited India and continues to give it a leadership platform. India has a space program many of you may or may not be aware of. There's criticism within India, whether that's needed or not, but it's part of the, again, belonging and posturing that India sees as important these days, whether it's, again, Indian movies that are suddenly becoming very popular. There's been just a spate of films after Slumdog Millionaire. I don't know if any of you have noticed, but there have been India-themed films coming out almost regularly from Hollywood. Most recently, I saw one called The Quarter Life Crisis, and it's, of course, about India and outsourcing and romances that came up as a result of that. So if you ever thought the computer service technician on the other side actually harbors warm feelings for you, it's likely when you see this movie, The Quarter Life Crisis. It's about a romance between a credit card collection agent in India and a customer who's lost a card in the US. Eat, Love, Pray, another film. So there's, you name it, it's all about India. Celebrity gate crashers, you remember them at the White House? Of course, it was an India party. That's why the security perhaps wasn't as tight as it could have been. They just said, oh, the Indians invited us, and they got in. So that's really was a sort of a facetious look at the fact that India is seemingly everywhere these days. But less facetiously, India is doing or trying to do some of the big and powerful country stuff. And that I mentioned some of them. India, one of the great tragedies in Indian history, by the way, or recent Indian history, was that India was not given a seat on the Security Council when the UN was formed. The seats were actually determined by way of losses in World War II. And India actually suffered the fourth largest loss under the aegis of the British Army. But given that India was still not formally independent at that time, and Winston Churchill, who hadn't lost his election at that point as yet, was able to successfully block that. So that's been a big aspiration for India, to be not a rotating member of the Security Council, but a permanent member of the Security Council. India recently got elected, now lobbying very hard to be on the permanent seat, have a permanent seat as it believes it deserves. It's certainly been there on all UN peacekeeping and military missions. So India is very conscious of its sort of international reputation in that regard. I just mentioned it has a lunar mission and a space program, a fairly advanced space program. Most of the leading developed countries, by the way, have staked out Antarctica. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with that there's actually a land grab going on in Antarctica. And of course, the most powerful countries are the ones who have gone and planted their flag lest something emerge that they can actually exploit. The same is true for the deep sea bed. The deep sea bed is a real source of minerals in the future. And again, many of the leading countries, even though it's been declared the common heritage of mankind, the ability to mine it is restricted to a few countries. India is among those countries as well. Most countries, however, they profess peace, try to sell arms. India is a fairly aspiring arms seller, again, mostly to Latin America and Brazil. They sell railroad cars. They're really targeting Africa as the next frontier. So these are all things that are, in a sense, common across the major economies of the world, and India has not been second in that regard. There, of course, recently, you may have heard of the Commonwealth Games in India. India joined its more powerful and richer brethren by also spending equally wastefully. That's a right all wealthy governments have, to create white elephants and spend really indefensible amounts. To give you a sense, India spent $18.5 billion on games that were, frankly, sort of a regional game, Commonwealth Games. Now, you may have heard some of the bad press surrounding that because the preparations were delayed, not unlike Athens. If you remember, the Athens Olympics were dogged by the fact that even a week before the Olympic Games, some of the facilities were not ready. In India, it was the same problem. 2 days before the Games, a major footbridge to the Games collapsed. It was a real black eye for the Indian government, but fortunately, everything did recover. The Games went off beautifully, and in fact, are a great source of pride. But again, there's great debate and criticism within India. Does India need some of these overtly excessive expenditures at this stage when there are also such deep, deep needs? Clearly, given that it's happened, the Indian government thinks so. But again, it's a sign that India wants to belong. India is seeking to be in the very upper tier. So in fact, I have a couple of images for you. This was from the opening ceremony of the Commonwealth Games, which was absolutely fantastic, by the way, and really worth seeing if you get a chance. There's 30, a few minutes snippets on the web for it. That particular dirigible that's suspended over the stadium was actually a technological marvel. Cost like $30 million to build just that, and was genuinely interesting. It was actually projecting images throughout. So that's one of the abiding images of the success of the game for India. This is a more traditional Indian image that were the large drums. But again, reminding you that India wanted to be second to none when it came to spending and presenting it, and will be bidding for the, I believe, 2020 Olympic Games. So on a global stage, clearly India's economy on the move. Large, fast-growing, huge domestic market. Unlike China, not as export-dependent. It's really domestically driven. Often people make the distinction that India, democracy came first, the free market came second. In China, it was sort of mixed, as it was in Russia, where it was really the free markets were ushered in, and then the collateral political reforms were tried with varying degrees of success. So one of the reasons the Indian so-called revolution is expected to be more stable is because the political institutions behind it are more stable. So certainly among those elements of stability is the fact that India has an unusually mature stock market. It's now one of the more advanced stock markets in the world. And as a result, private equity money continues to flow in, not at the same level as it has been in China, but India has been maintaining a very, very steady pace. So every year there's been about $3 to $7 billion. And that's the largest range because of the last few years, but on an average, $5 billion a year, which is a very, very significant amount. Among the various statistics, one that I picked out for you, and in fact was since I was here in 2006. When I was here, I spoke about mobile phone connections. 60 million. In 4 years, that's grown to 500 million phone connections. That's actually a startling penetration and a startling number in terms of the infrastructure required and what it has meant in terms of liberating Indian businesses and Indian consumers. But again, there are 1,800 new business schools that have started in the last 2 years. Verdi talked about IT graduates. India graduates more than 2 million computer science graduates every year. I was working with the Czech Republic, which is a very fine source of mathematical minds, wants to position itself in outsourcing. And I was with the information minister, and I just asked, I said, how many graduates are there, computer science graduates are there in the Czech Republic every year? And he said 1,500. That was less than probably one college in Bangalore. So there's a real scale issue, and over time, as India increases the quality of the education that these graduates receive, that's going to become a real asset for them. So to do that, there's a big boom in the education sector. As I said, many new universities, 1,800 new business schools. Another small snippet, India recently became the largest market for English language newspapers. It overtook the US. And that's with only 20% of the Indian population actually reading newspapers. So you can imagine that as education grows, there's now 90 million plus English newspapers sold every day in India. So there's just across the board, there are eye-popping numbers. I didn't want to just throw numbers at you, but if you look at automobile ownership, home ownership, internet connections, IT sourcing, and within that, I just threw in those names for amusement as anything else. Those are new kinds of outsourcing that you're going to hear more and more about. Business process outsourcing, or BPO, has become fairly common. The new ones are now KPO, or knowledge process outsourcing, and LPO, legal process outsourcing, and there are various kinds of outsourcing. So there's a tremendous amount of natural synergy between the US and India. 7 out of every 10 jobs actually outsourced from the US goes specifically to India. Just so you know, and this is something that comes up, only 2 out of every 10 jobs outsourced actually go outside the US. So despite what you may have heard in the press, offshore outsourcing is not that dominant or prevalent. 80% of all outsourcing in the US is actually domestic. It just goes to other firms. It's a form of specialization. However, of the 20%, that which goes, 70% of that goes to India. So India is a prime favored destination. And to leap forward, in a sense, to the second half of our talk, that's one of the binding facts between the US and India, and is not likely to change in the near future. For the other factors, again, indicative of India's rapid ascension, it rebounded very quickly from the meltdown, much faster, certainly, than the US and the European countries. It continues to grow at a brisk 6 to 8%. And there's all kinds of new avenues beginning. Vedi mentioned one, so I'll just briefly allude to that. The Foreign University Bill. One of the ways that India sees its opportunity to move forward is by educating its youth, and they've recently made a landmark decision to allow foreign universities to set up campus within India. So you could, in theory, get a Harvard degree in India from the Harvard University campus in India, similarly with UCF or any others. There's a number of universities actually that are now entering the Indian market. And as I was telling Vedi, I've been working with several of them, and they are just seeing numbers of students that are attracting them and the ability to charge fees almost at global levels. So that's going to be, again, a big boost for India as well. And similar things are happening in nuclear energy, in infrastructure, in agriculture. There's some very interesting developments in Indian agriculture. You know, the image that we grew up with in the 60s was, especially in the 50s, of starving children in India and Africa. Sadly, that is not entirely untrue even today. It's less so in India. India has long produced the food that it needed to feed itself. It was just that the distribution was really poor, storage was really poor. So often the shortages that did occur in the 60s and 70s came from bad distribution and bad storage. Today, it's turned the other way around, and now there's anticipation that over the next 30 years, India will become one of the major agricultural centers of the world. That's also true, by the way, for wine. Any of you who's non-Indian ever had any Indian wine? Ever tried Indian wine? Good, well, absolutely. 10 years later, or even 5 or 7 years later, I suggest we'll be looking at a very different picture. A recent study, to give you an example, showed 22 zones within India that are exactly like Napa or Napa Valley. Agroclimatically, they're perfectly suited. And French vintners arrived in India in the early 70s. And it takes about 30 to 35 years for the vines to mature. And so again, that's a sunrise industry for India, Indian champagnes, Indian wines. So Indian agriculture is another big area that's been growing. Just more lightly, on the home front, I thought it'd be amusing for you, and you may have noticed how frequent India mentions are, and also how much currency Indians seem to be gaining even within the US. Certainly this administration has more people from South Asia and India than in the past. We're looking at CEOs of major firms, and I could name a number of them, but Pepsi and the much maligned Citibank, while it took the bailout, by the way, had an Indian CEO. Whether that's good or bad or not, we don't know. HP, one of the contenders, is also an Indian. The deans of major business schools, this is a new development. Harvard now has an Indian dean. The Kellogg School had an Indian dean. INSEAD, London Business School, Wharton's considering somebody. So again, their impact in business education. Indian students are here in record numbers. Mostly, by the way, many of them can't get into the institutions back in India. The competition is so intense that, frankly, it's opened out an opportunity in Australia, in the UK, and in the US. Indian tourists, and I'm sure you've noticed them, especially in Orlando. They love Orlando. You may have read about celebrity weddings. It's the other way around. US tourism in India has jumped radically, I believe by 400% over the last 3 years. Traditional weddings in India have become a very popular tourist activity. I don't know if any of you followed recent wedding between pop singer Katy Perry and somebody else. It was apparently one of the largest weddings in India for a long time. So this two-way process, and again, all kinds of other things. You're noticing Indian food, So overall, the notion of a pervasive, more visible India is very, very evident. Let me spend a minute on Hollywood and Bollywood. Anybody ever seen a Bollywood film? Non-Indians who've seen a Bollywood film. And again, I'm surprised and pleasantly surprised by the numbers. I suspect, again, that will increase. Bollywood is a subtle cultural hegemony, only second to Hollywood in the world. And in many places, it's outpacing Hollywood. It's far more acceptable all across Africa. I've traveled literally from Morocco in West Africa to Somalia in East Africa, and the most popular films literally across the spectrum are Bollywood films. They've now penetrated Eastern Europe. They've long had a foothold in Russia. They're now popular in Latin America. Somebody recently wrote to me that the most popular soap opera in Bolivia is an Indian soap opera. And again, it's all Bollywood related. Next time you go to Times Square, you'll be perhaps surprised to see the giant billboards advertising Bollywood films in Times Square. So there's a subtle shift going on in terms of the encroachment and also the work that's happening together between these two cultural powerhouses. And Bollywood and Hollywood have something very important to presage in terms for world peace, ironically. As a marketer, I can tell you they've done more to homogenize global consumption and help develop global brands via clever product placement. It's not by accident that Tom Cruise picks up a Diet Coke, and the same thing is true in the Hollywood films. Whoever the big star is, what products they consume, they're very much tied into the marketing engines of that. So again, that was the overall sort of theme that India, already strong, starting to look good. What does the picture look like for the next 20 to 30 years? On surface, it looks even better. And that's because India is set to reap a demographic dividend. And I'll show you some numbers. We'll come back to this one. But just look at this. The demographic dividend comes from the youth or the relative youth of India. India has an estimated 350 million people under 15. That's greater than the population of the United States. That they're under 15, 120 million, and in fact the number may have risen a little bit, 120 million are under 5. That's more than Germany or Japan. You look at 500 million under 35. So this is a young country. What does that mean for the next 20 or 30 years when the rest of the world is aging? And where in the US, for the first time 3 years ago, our midpoint age actually increased over 40. The psychological center of gravity, as people often say, shifted for the first time over 40. And actually that has led to a great number of changes in the US as a result. But these are young countries, and the implication is that when it comes to having people in the workforce in 2030, there are going to be a few countries that have the advantage. They are going to have the young people. By definition, that's going to mean that they're going to take a larger share of the working resources. They'll fill more positions literally around the world. I mentioned about the 2 million IT. There are 20 to 30 million people moving into cities every year in India. As the Indian government, as they have to cope with this idea, imagine what that means for the real estate industry, for infrastructure, for transportation, for consumer goods, for malls, you name it. I mean, so the boom picture is unlikely to be altered in the very near future. 2 of the top 5 mega cities of the world. Delhi today is Greater Delhi is bigger than Greater Los Angeles. It takes 2.5 hours to drive across New Delhi today. It's 86 miles. I mean, it actually is not, but it's so crowded it takes a lot of time, and so is Mumbai. Both will have more than 15 million people. These are very, very large cities. 8 out of the 10 fastest growing cities all happen to be in India. Many of them cities you likely may not have heard of. So again, there's just tremendous growth. But having said that, having mentioned all of these really bright statistics, there's 750 millions who are outside this much ballyhooed miracle. So it's really important to understand that. That's the dark shadow over both China and India, that while they have such substantial numbers that even if portions of them are really doing well, those portions are enough to be bigger and move major economies. If you have 250 million people, in fact, I'll show you this number. This is a number for the middle class. The middle class, or the proportion of the people in quotes in the middle class earning middle class incomes, is a bellwether for the way a country develops. India is well on its way to being almost 50%. We have 368 million people estimated in the middle class, which means they're earning in the $30,000 to $40,000 a year range. Just so you know, that's not an unusually low number. The US median income for a family of 4 is about $39,000. That's the median income, not the average income, just the midpoint. But in India too, the middle class is approaching that global norm, so you can imagine the effects they have on consumption, because they want everything. They want everything. So it's a really, it's a consumer or a consumption and or a FMCG, fast-moving consumer goods paradise. So again, as I mentioned, however, all of this has still left 750 million people not necessarily in poverty, but outside the money economy. Ironically, recently, studies on income inequality were released, and the biggest gap is in the US. The biggest gap is between those who are in the wealthiest 1%, and the bottom 1% is the largest in the US, based on the study. In India and many of the developing countries too, it's extremely sharp. The gap is very, very sharp. But I wanted to emphasize that the 750 million people who are mostly in agriculture are in many cases outside the money economy. They live on farms, they feed themselves, they're really not accounted for. And on a positive side, what India has done is become the first country in the world to implement a biometric identification system. They're going to actually identify each one of the 1.1 billion Indians, and that's going to become the gateway for a whole range of new services. So India has become the first country to implement this unique identification system, primarily to see what can be done to uplift this 750 million, because they will be the millstone around the India development story if they're not addressed. So let me show you, I'm not sure if you can see these as clearly. I apologize, they're a little small. I may walk over to one of them to just point out something. I didn't bring my pointer, so I'm going to use my operatic voice, and you can hear me. But if you look at this statistic from The Economist, and by the way, everybody's welcome to the presentation. You can certainly look. You'll see that by 2050, 50% of the Indian population will be, in quotes, age-dependent and not working, but that means 50% will. In China, that same number will have climbed to 70% by that time. That means only 30% will be in the workforce. Having said that, China's installed base of people in the working age is still very high. They almost have 970 million people. So even though it's not growing as fast as India, because China is older than India because of its one-child policy and various other policies that it had, the fact remains that India and China will have the most young people over the next 50 years, and that has profound implications for the world. The rest of these are also interesting. The other one that's noteworthy here, that even though India is not considered an export economy, if you track it, and this is from the years since they liberalized, India is tracking fairly well with China on exports. But nevertheless, they're distant second. So again, as I said, they're a growing partner, they're a growing power, becoming more powerful. What are India's major drivers? What gives India its stance in the world, and what are its major drivers? The first, of course, is growth and poverty alleviation, and I mentioned the reasons clearly. You've got so many people to uplift literally out of really abject poverty, and people who, while they may be living lives that are surprisingly dignified and cheerful, anybody who's actually traveled in the rural countrysides of India and China will be impressed by the dignity and the equanimity of the people. But nevertheless, by any standard economic terms, they have a very, very long way to go. So growth and poverty alleviation is very, very critical. The second is security amidst hostile geopolitics, and I'm going to spend a few minutes on that. And the third, we may return to at the end, and is this idea of India returning to its place in the world. This is something that's shared in China as well. If you track the last 20 centuries, in effect, India and China were dominant players in some fashion in the world economy for about 14 of those 20 centuries. And some could argue even more. Even as late as 1700, I've seen figures that half of the world's GDP at that time, this is prior to the Industrial Revolution, could be traced by the, I guess, relatively primitive assessment methods that to India and China. So in one way, many ways, people see this as a return to that old primacy, barring this gap of a few hundred years. With regard to India and the US, we see obviously many, many similarities. I mentioned the market complementarity. America has the resources, America has the needs, America has a leadership position in a number of industries. India has the manpower to service that. Similarly, they're both the world's bellwether democracies. They're radically different. The most notable element of India's democracy is participation rates are really high. And it's hard to figure why they're so high, despite the illiteracy. In a recent state in India, Maoist rebels actually took over half of the election booths, and still that state registered 53%. That's serious commitment to exercising your franchise. That's something that dogs the US on another, is the lack of participation in elections. The US participation rates tend to stay in the low 40s. So overall, I want to rush over to the next thing, so I won't tell you too much about the next idea, but if you do a broader study, that India and the US are natural allies, and they're political and economic allies in most cases, other than the environmental summit. So I just wanted to show you very quickly India and its proximate neighbors, and why, to understand India, you really need to understand China. China has, in effect, encircled India and has truncated India's borders. And that has left India very, very nervous. So I'm just going to show you one quick thing. In this map of India, which, by the way, is India's official map of the way it looks, is not the way China presents the map of India, or what the real map of India is. The real map of India actually lost that upper top area right here. The Chinese invaded India in 1962, took that piece of territory, and have not given it back. They also took about 25,000 square miles in this area, mostly as an irritant to make sure that India didn't pressure them on that area. So as a result, the threat of Chinese aggression has always kept India very sobered. It led to radical changes. Now China is building warm water ports with Bangladesh and Burma. They have a highway through Tibet into China to get them directly to Africa. They're working with Sri Lanka to build a port here. So as a result, India is very insecure about its position. So to understand India's relationships with America, it's very important to understand India's insecurity with China. All the great things that I mentioned that India is doing, they're actually number 2 to one country, and that's China. China is doing each of those things on a slightly larger scale. So India's concerns, therefore, are significant, and therefore it brings it naturally to the US and also to a lesser extent to Russia, to balance off the perceived, really the threat from China, and also the notion that it's being encircled by unfriendly allies. Let's see. Okay, one point I think that's worthy of mention that's also irritant between India-American relationships is this notion of these billions of dollars going to fight terrorism in Pakistan. What has India concerned is a bulk of that is actually going to shore up the Pakistani military, which is on the India-Pakistan border, and that's been openly understood, and so that remains a big irritant. And so as a result, the good side of it for the U.S. is that the U.S. has been used this to sell more arms to India. But there's this arms race in India and in the subcontinent, which is of some clear concern. So overall, Bob talked about the US concerns with China. India's concerns are really the security vulnerabilities and coming out second best. Even though the bilateral trade between the two countries has increased very sharply, I've seen an astounding statistic that by the year 2100, 40% of world trade is expected to be bilateral between India and China. That's an extremely interesting number. If you think 4 out of $10 being traded by the year 2100 being purely between India and China, it goes to show how large these economies might indeed become. So again, to end, In fact, we have Yao, who's coming later, who will talk about Brazil as a key third player. I wanted to say a few things about Brazil playing a complementary role, and that the India, US, and Brazil are likely to become a strong trilateral partner, even as they seek to ward off the influence of China in a number of areas. But overall prognosis is that the US and India will be trusted allies and partners well into the 21st century, primarily because of the underlying dynamics that bring them naturally together. Thank you.
Ask about the languages spoken by the average Indian and how many languages are spoken as compared to languages spoken in the US and
Yeah, that's a great question. In India, as many of you know, its origins are really Europe-like, and it was formed in a sense to repel the British and became a single country only in 1950, or 47 really, but they became a republic in 50. Before that, India was 500 separate kingdoms. So that diversity exists. There are almost 800 recognizable languages and dialects, but there are 18 official languages. And when I say official languages, that means these are languages that have literature, poetry, cinema, a long history. So 18 official languages, which makes Indian bureaucratic examinations, by the way, a nightmare, because you're constitutionally allowed to take it in any of the languages, and then they have to translate them into English. Of course, many of them take it in English, and India has a very large group of English speakers. So 18 official languages.
Problems with India is the movement of commerce within the country and the ability of entrepreneurs to get back and forth between cities.
Briefly, yes. I mean, that is, you very accurately identified, that's one of the biggest obstacles. And so therefore, it's also one of the biggest sunrise sectors. There are a lot of innovative models being used, including private corporations building and owning the highway for a certain number of periods, as a way of accelerating things that the World Bank and India can't do. But it's very much the biggest priority right now. Billions of dollars going into it. Thank you very much.
Can benefit a lot from the previous and excellent presentation on India, and actually even use some slides to just change the name India to replace it with Brazil. But when I arrived at the hotel last night, I did not see any Brazilian soap opera on Univision. But I arrived while I was flying in from Washington D.C. I was arriving in a Brazilian-made airplane from Embraer, and there are other things that if you read the newspaper in the past 3-4 months. You see that Brazilian firms are buying American firms, such as Burger King was bought by a Brazilian investment fund 2 months ago, and the other Swift and Pilgrim are being bought by Brazilian firms as well. So just an example of this, how the BRICS countries are having much more of an influence, not only in global affairs, but also in the United States and such traditional markets in the United States. But to talk about Brazil as a rising power and what it means for the U.S., first we need to address the question that what it means for Brazil. And I think that a lot of people in Brazil do not know that, don't have that idea so clearly, that what does it mean to have more power, to have more visibility in world affairs, and to focus on that idea first, look inside Brazil. It gives us a little bit more a possibility of understanding what the country thinks, what the country wants, and consequently, what are the possibilities of its relations with the United States. So the first issue that I'm going to address is what's behind Brazil's rise. What are the factors? And this is an important issue because when you think about emerging powers, you today, in so popular term, not only in financial sectors, BRICS was coined by a Goldman Sachs report in 2003, I believe. but also, you see the term regional powers, emerging powers so often. But you get the sense that maybe it could be a early 1970s redux. There's a lot of talk back in the early 70s about emerging powers. And then came the oil crisis, and that talk, suddenly 20 years of non-emerging powers, of submerging powers. In the case of Brazil, that's really important, because in the early 1970s, there was this moment in Brazil. Brazil was living through a military regime, but the economy was growing at 10 to 15% a year, the GDP. So it's called the Brazilian economic miracle. And the Brazilian government, the military government, had this project of being a major global power, including this nuclear program to build a nuclear bomb. So are we talking today about Brazil and rise in that sense? And the second question is, does this rise, how much of this rise has to do with the popularity of this, our president, President Lula, that Obama had met him, I think 2 years ago, saying that this is Obama at the height of his popularity, recently elected. He met Lula and said, "This is the man. This is and in Brazil, people there went crazy, because basically the most popular man and powerful man on earth, pointing to the Brazilian president and saying that he was the popular guy and he was the man. So, and Lula's presidential diplomacy has been somewhat hyperactive in the past few years. And how much of Brazil's rise then has to do, is it 1970s redux, or how much has to do with basically a really popular president? I wanted to say first that there are two main factors of stability that contribute to Brazil's rise, consistent pillars of Brazil's rise. First, on the political side, political stability. The return to democracy in the mid-1980s. It was a negotiated return to democracy. Brazil, the military regime handed over the government to civilians in 1985, and we had a major presidential election in 1989. And this process of democratization in Brazil has, became stable through the past 25 years. Second, in 1988, we had a major constitution, basically a democratic constitution signed with a lot of advancements in terms of political rights, economic rights, social rights in Brazil. 1992, we had the first popular elected president in Brazil after the democratization period was impeached for corruption scandals. And that was important in terms of political stability, because the new and still frail political institutions in Brazil showed that they were strong enough to pass through that test without going back to a military coup or something like that. So that Fernando Collor de Mello, who was president, he was impeached in 1992, and the Brazilian institutions, political institutions, worked rather well to basically contain that political crisis. Then we had Fernando Henrique Cardoso as president of Brazil, first president in 2 terms, 8 years in Brazil, who introduced a lot of reforms, and it was really important in terms of political stability as well. And lastly, President Lula and his Workers' Party, the PT, came into power in 2002 as what I call the last frontier, as the last great political force in Brazil that needed to govern. So today, Brazil, all major political forces in Brazil were in government at one period or another. So that is really important in terms of political instability. The second dimension is the economic dimension, the economic stability of the past 20 years or so, beginning with the gradual liberalization of the economy in the early 1990s. Brazil was a very closed economy and began opening up first to the region, to our neighbors in Mercosur, and then gradually over other areas, other sectors. Then we had this major stabilization plan. Brazil was always world champion, not only in soccer, but also in inflation. For a lot of after the Second World War in the early 1980s. We had the Real Plan, which introduced a new currency and finally stabilized the economy. That Fernando Henrique Cardoso was the economic minister then, and then president that implemented the plan. Unfinished but important reforms were also made throughout the 1990s, mainly in the public sector in Brazil. Welfare reform, partial, but still were very important in terms of reining in costs, government spending, and making government a little bit smaller. Also a policy of privatizations of major state-owned enterprises like Embraer, the aircraft manufacturer, Vale do Rio Doce mining company, and others that became Brazilian national champions, companies that today they are worth billions of dollars and they operate all over the world. There was also policies in terms of fiscal responsibility. As I said, Brazil's government, central government, became much more responsible in terms of spending, and that created a lot of stability for investors, basically. Also, we have the central autonomous central bank operating, quite distant from political influence, and we have inflation targets. So it's very responsible economic policy, monetary policy, fiscal policy, which means that there is today in Brazil somewhat of a political consensus on key economic policies. And that's very important in terms of Brazil, because before President Lula's election in 2002, there was this great concern that his party would undo everything that was done in terms of stabilization. So once his party came into power and respected and kept most economic policies intact, the Lula risk factor probably vanished. So when you see major political parties in Brazil today, they agree on most economic policies. We're talking about detailed specifics, which for a new democracy such as Brazil, it's a very good sign. A little bit of boredom in politics is a good sign. Those factors combined with favorable international economic environment throughout much of Lula's 2 terms, this prior, of course, to the 2008 beginning of the financial crisis. These factors paved the way for sustainable economic growth of Brazil in the past 8 years or so, or even 10 years or so. And also for Brazil's social development. As a result, we see now Brazil as this commodity powerhouse, this major agricultural powerhouse in the world. I mean, if you look at major crops, orange juice, soy, sugar, ethanol, Brazil ranks at least in top 4 or 3 in the West. Even beef, Brazil ranks as the top world producers and exporters of these crops. And I mentioned before the internationalization of Brazilian champions, big Brazilian companies basically operating all over the world, as Embraer, as a major aircraft builder. Brazil's mining company, I think, is the 2nd largest in the world, and so on and so forth. And as a result, we have a moment of higher and sustainable GDP growth in Brazil. Successful social policies of poverty alleviation programs called Bolsa Familia is one cash transfer program that was established by President Lula that has basically created a new middle class in Brazil. Brazil is a very unequal society, but for the first time ever, Brazil's middle class is the largest social class in the country. So Brazil has almost 200 million people, and more than half of that now is middle class, which is really very important because it wasn't like that. So these policies basically took these people out of poverty, and they became not only citizens but actually consumers of goods. And for the future, there are good prospects for investments in Brazil. Brazil is not only an agricultural powerhouse and invests in biofuels, but also, in the past 2-3 years, there are a lot of discoveries of oil fields in the continental platform, Atlantic Ocean, deep sea oil fields, and a lot of investments are planned for the next several years in Petrobras, the state-owned enterprise. Also, we have the next World Cup in Brazil in 2014, and the next Olympics also in Brazil in Rio de Janeiro in 2016. Those are all, favorable factors for future investments in the country in the years to come. And of course, you have President Lula as this very popular and charismatic international leader. Also, this is the result of Brazil's. This is basically, in a nutshell, Brazil's rise. So we have now, I would say, a few imperatives in Brazil when you talk about Brazil. You have the political imperative, that is democracy. It's a democratic country. There's no way back. Every major political party has governed Brazil, so that means that the rules of the game are respected. You have the economic imperative that, as I mentioned before, is stabilization. No one is advocating playing a platform of crazy economic policies in Brazil. Well, there are a few, but they have no chance of winning the elections, which is a good sign. The social imperative are the social policies, the poverty alleviation programs, the cash transfers, Bolsa Familia. 1/4 of Brazil's population, basically, give or take, receive some sort of cash transfer program. It's really relevant to remote parts of Brazil, northern Brazil or northeastern Brazil. So those are important imperatives that, the third rail of Brazil's, politics and economics and social policies. And the question I ask is there an imperative on foreign policy, on Brazil's foreign policy? There's no consensus yet on what Brazil's foreign policy should be, but as Brazil becomes more assertive internationally, foreign policy, of course, gains more importance in Brazilian domestic political debate. Today, foreign policy in Brazil is is a major issue being discussed by Congress, by the media, because basically Brazilians' lives today are much more affected by what happens in the world than it was 20, 30 years ago in the region and also elsewhere, climate change and other issues. So just to focus a little bit on Brazil-U.S. relations, what does this rise mean for Brazil and U.S.? I'm going to just, on recent history here, since the end of the Cold War, actually, Brazil has shown, if you compare with other Latin American countries like Chile, Mexico, or Argentina, Brazil has shown a little bit less enthusiasm to engage with the U.S. Brazil's brand of liberalism or Brazil's embrace of the Washington Consensus, the liberalizing policies, was not so wholeheartedly as was in Argentina or Chile or Mexico. So Brazil always was a little bit reluctant to deal with the United States. And also, but on the other hand, if you compare Brazil with our Bolivarian neighbors like Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, Brazil's anti-American rhetoric is much more mild, I say, if you compare it with Chavez or other characters like that. Which means that Brazil's relation to the U.S. basically is one of benign indifference benign because it doesn't, it sometimes is good to be off the U.S.'s radar. Because, in Brazil sometimes they complain that why isn't the U.S. paying any attention to us or to Latin America in general? But when the U.S. does, we complain that they're paying a lot of attention. So actually, what does Brazil want? We don't know. I think that, and what does the U.S. want as well? There's a problem as well, how to deal with Brazil and how to deal with Latin America. I think that the U.S. does not have a lot to offer Brazil in terms of a trade deal. I don't think here in Florida, you guys know, for example, orange juice, when you buy orange juice in the supermarket, it says Brazilian and Florida oranges. But in Brazil, the exporters of oranges and other products, they complained that, you know, a lot of taxes on specific Brazilian products to come to the United States. So I think both sides, they live rather well and comfortably with the idea of benign indifference. You know, just keep the dialogue, you know, a formal, you know, not a lot of problems in the regional area. That was the case before, and hasn't been the case in the past few months, I would say. For example, one of the major issues on the agenda was the free trade area of the Americas. Neither the U.S., neither Brazil wanted that to go forth with one another. I mean, the U.S. kept its trade policy of signing hub and spoke deals with other Latin American countries. The free trade deal with Chile, it has with Mexico already, with Central America, with Colombia, so on and so forth. And Brazil has also its own agenda with Mercosur and a much less liberalizing foreign trade agenda. So, but you know, these two countries, the two largest democracies in the Western Hemisphere in terms of population, they coexist, you know, rather well. And despite President Bush's relations with Lula was really good. There were a lot of exchanges of state visits and high-level meetings between not only the two presidents but also between their cabinets. But what came out of it, you know, policy wasn't really relevant. The major issue is a memorandum of understanding on ethanol. But still, both they're the two largest producers and exporters of ethanol in the world, Brazil and the United States. But there's a drop of Brazilian ethanol that comes into the U.S. So, you know, that's what I mean by benign indifference. Also, Bush's foreign policy, the focus on war on terror, that kind of gave Brazil a few openings to pursue a much more assertive foreign policy in its own region, its own backyard, South America. But overall, Lula's relation with Bush was a good relation, despite one being a left-wing in Brazil and Bush being a more conservative here in the United States. Lula knew how to deal with Bush. I mean, he was slightly favorable to Bush's re-election in 2004. So when Obama comes along, it was a big surprise for Brazil. I mean, there's a lot of expectations in Brazil that with this new president of the United States, what it will mean for Brazil. But mainly on United States relations with emerging powers. How was the United States going to engage with emerging powers like India, like China, like Russia, and like Brazil? So there's a big question mark there. So far, we see, for example, on regional issues in the region, Latin America, some hotspots between Brazil and the United States. On Cuba, for example, this government, President Lula's government, has historic ties with the Castro administration because it's left-wing. And there's all this expectation that Cuba was going to re-enter into hemispheric organizations, and Brazil played an important part in trying to lobby for that idea. But that issue hasn't gone so well in the past few months. There was an expectation that the policy in the United States towards Cuba was going to change more than it did. So, and Brazil wanted that. Brazil wanted to play a part as a possible interlocutor between both countries, but that wasn't the case yet. Honduras, also a coup d'etat in Honduras last year. Brazil also, in the United States, they played different roles in that idea. Brazil, to this day, does not recognize the new government of Honduras, and the United States does. The United States military bases in Colombia, right next to Brazil's border, they were established without any prior talks with the Brazilian government. So, and the United States afterwards recognized that it wasn't very, sensitive to Brazil's ideas or concerns, but that was also a major problem. And this reestablishment of the Fourth Fleet of the U.S. Navy, also that's in the southern Atlantic. Brazil also was a little bit surprised with that. And finally, even Haiti. Brazil leads the UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And after the earthquake In the beginning of the year, the initial relief efforts were led by the United States, and then even that, Brazil was kind of concerned of the United States' influence and what that would mean for Brazilian and UN peacekeeping mission in Haiti at that point. So these are all little bit tensions in the region between both countries, and part of the problem that is hampering Brazil and U.S. cooperation in the region is that on one side, from the U.S.'s point of view, in Washington, there's an expectation that Brazil would be keen, or at least open, to the idea of sharing the burdens and the costs of maintaining the regional order. And from Brazil's point of view, there's this reluctance in Brazil of how much it's able or willing to pay, actually, to maintain the regional order, to deal with Chavez, to deal with these problems that I mentioned before. And that has to do with the different approaches that Brazil historically has towards its own region, its own neighborhood. First, Brazil has three interpretations of how it looks at its own region, South America. First, it sees the region as a source of instability for Brazil. You see Brazil imports a lot of natural gas from Bolivia, for example, has a major binational dam with Paraguay. There are a lot of immigrants, illegal immigrants from Bolivia and Brazil, and Chavez right across the border. You have the drug problem in Colombia, and so on and so forth. And Brazil has always seen the region as a source of problem, and that as an incentive to create regional institutions that served also to fend off U.S. intermission in regional affairs. So that creates tension. That idea of Brazil seeing the region as a problem tends to create problems in Brazil's engagement with the U.S. to deal with other issues in the region. Second, Brazil sees the region as a protective shield also against negative externalities of globalization. Brazil started opening up its economy to the region, to the neighbors, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, as a means to control globalization, as a means to gradually open its economy and to have its companies compete with other companies. It's this sense that's not so true, but still that you were able to control globalization and the flow of goods and capital. But Brazil also sees that region as a training ground for Brazil's role in the world and in terms of economy mostly. And lastly, Brazil also sees the region as a possible launching pad or platform for Brazilian power in the world. Brazil wanting to represent South America in the UN Security Council. That's official rhetoric of Brazil, despite the fact that Brazil's most important opponents are in South America, Colombia and Argentina, opposed to Brazil's bid to the Security Council, and Mexico as well. In general, those different readings that Brazil has of its own region, there are obstacles to U.S. Brazil's much closer engagement in the region. And I think the U.S. has a problem to deal with Brazil, that we are seeing a transition point in the U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, and Brazil specifically, should Brazil be dealt with as part of a major Latin America agenda, or should Brazil be dealt with bilaterally as an emerging power? Because Brazil's economy has grown so much in the past few years that the asymmetry between Brazil and its neighbors is huge. Brazil it's more than half of the Latin America's economy, more than half of Latin America's population. You speak a different language, and so on and so forth. So I think that the U.S. saw this giant rise from corruption, debt, all the economic and political problems that we had before, and hasn't had the idea yet of how to deal exactly with this country. Should we deal with it in the Latin America agenda, or should we deal with it like we deal directly with India, with China, and with Russia, mainly on bilateral terms? And those differences, they show in forums like the climate change forums and the negotiations in Copenhagen, where the two countries were sitting in opposite ends of the table. Also, the nuclear proliferation, the Iranian deal, Brazil, along with Turkey, tried to draft a resolution or go against the resolution that was drafted by the United States that imposed sanctions on Iran. And that also was a important point of tension between those two countries. But just to conclude, today's U.S. ambassador to Brazil, he sums up rather nicely the idea of the two countries, what's happening between the two countries today. He said a few months ago that as Brazil becomes more assertive globally, we are going to bump into Brazil on new issues and in new places such as Iran, the Middle East, and Haiti. It is challenging for both of us because it means that we have to rethink on how we understand our relationship. And that we're at the moment of rethinking that, I think, on both sides, actually, from the U.S. perspective and from Brazil, because I don't think both countries know exactly what they want. Brazil does not want a trade deal from the United States. Brazil does not want any major deals, like, for example, we see the negotiations between the nuclear negotiations between Russia and the United States, between the United States and China with the financial sector and economic deals, the nuclear deal with India, and what's the agenda between Brazil and the United States? I think for now what Brazil wants is mainly recognition from the United States as an important player, not only in regional affairs, but also in global affairs. But, but it's that, wanting it does not make it seem right also, because Brazil also has to show what it really is capable of doing, and, in terms of helping not only Haiti, the peacekeeping mission there, but also what does Brazil has to offer the world once it gets, if it gets that recognition. So the interesting thing to end is that Brazil and the United States, they're the two most influential countries in the hemisphere, in the Americas, two democracies, and it means that these two countries are very important, and they cannot ignore each other. And this benign indifference that I mentioned, I think it tends to be unstable in the future, not so benign or not so indifferent, depending on which side you prefer. But their current relationship, however, unveils the difficulty for both in forging a consensus on critical issues, as I mentioned here. But I think the basic idea is that, mainly from the U.S.'s perspective, is that the fact that Brazil and the United States share a lot of norms and ideas like democracy, like human rights, that necessarily they're partners. They will become partners. Or that the idea that Latin America was and forever will be United States' backyard. Also, it's the idea that that's one of the reasons that explains why Brazil, there are not a lot of Brazilian specialists in the U.S. as there are China specialists, India specialists, and Russia specialists, because they tend to see this as a natural ally, because we're in the same region. It's the only great emerging power next to the U.S., very close to the U.S., and of the BRICS, and we share a lot of values with the U.S. And I'll end with that for questions, actually.
The main subject is the relationship between Brazil and USA. But I would like to know, what do you think about your neighbor, Argentina?
What will happen to Argentina and what will happen to its relations with Brazil? Just a brief note on recent history. Brazil's main goal in foreign policy for the past 30 years has been its foreign policy towards Argentina. In the 60s and 70s, both countries were rivals, and both had nuclear programs, and almost somewhat close to building a nuclear bomb, each country. And suddenly, in the late 1970s, a military regime in both countries decided to end their rivalry, suddenly. And in 1979, they signed a treaty, and throughout the 80s, they opened their nuclear programs to each other. And this model of rapprochement between Argentina and Brazil was actually offered to India and Pakistan to try to deal their nuclear differences. Of course, there are a lot of cultural differences in both regions, but still, people tend to downplay what might have been if Brazil had a nuclear bomb and Argentina had a nuclear bomb, and that was the case, close to the case 30, 40 years ago. But in Brazil, and that is one of the main issues of Brazilian foreign policy, and that's a third rail of Brazilian foreign policy, the nuclear deal with Argentina. That's unnegotiable. But the fact is that from that, it grew into a more broad agenda between both countries, mainly according to trade, Mercosul, the customs union between Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay. And that has worked rather well. That worked well in the first 10 years or so, but hasn't worked well now. There's a lot of trade disputes between both countries. And I think that that will have to be dealt with by both countries in the very near future. Or you free those two countries to pursue any trade negotiations that they wish, because today they're binded. They cannot negotiate separately free trade agreements. They have to negotiate together, or they decide to really strengthen Mercosul institutions. And I think we're in a crossroads. I think both countries are reluctant. Because Argentina is opposites. I think Brazil, if you look at the GDP growth in the 20th century, Brazil is one of the countries that had the fastest growth in the whole 20th century, I think only behind Japan. And Argentina is the exact opposite. Argentina was one of the fifth or eighth largest economy in the early 20th century, and basically it went downhill. So, and they crossed in the 60s, where the rivalry was very alive. And now I think both countries don't know yet what to do in the near future. It's stable in terms of strategic politics and nuclear politics, but in terms of economic policies and trade policies, I think that important changes will have to come. Well, crime has always been an issue in Brazil. I'm from Rio de Janeiro, and that's really a day-to-day thing, unfortunately, in Brazil. And as I talk here about foreign policy, I think there's also this growing idea that there is a link between foreign policy and crime. Brazil's main drug dealer was arrested in Colombia, for example. And there are close links between Colombia cartels and Brazil drug traffickers, drug and arms deals. And I think it's one of the main issues Brazil had a lot of priorities to deal with, a lot of problems. And the poverty issue has been dealt with very competently the past 5 or 10 years. And as it becomes less of a problem, I think crime is the next one to tackle in the major big cities like Rio and São Paulo. And I think there's a political problem as well, because Brazil is a federation of states, but it's a very unorganized federation of states, actually. And state level has to deal with crime, and federal level doesn't do a lot about it. So I think that will be a major issue. As Brazil rises, not only its good traits are more visible, but also its bad traits. And I think that's good, that Brazil will have to deal with those vulnerabilities, internal vulnerabilities, and also external ambiguities, I think. Thank you.
This program was made possible by funding from the UCF Global Perspectives Office.